Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and in this video I'm going to go through some basic horticulture terminology. This video is aimed at the beginner through intermediate levels, and of course I won't be able to go through the whole dictionary of horticulture terms, but I'm going to start with the most common, and then of course if you have other questions you can drop those into the comments of the video for discussion. The term horticulture itself refers to the intensive cultivation of plants. Sometimes you'll see it referring to outdoor nursery settings and nursery beds or other intensive crop production outdoors, and sometimes you'll see it referring to indoor crop cultivation. Because horticulture is the intensive cultivation of plants, you're going to need lots and lots of plants to do it. The act of making more plants is called propagation, and propagation comes in two general categories. There is asexual propagation and sexual propagation. Asexual propagation is like what you see here, cuttings that were taken from mother plants, and they are genetically identical to the parent plant. The other way is sexual propagation. That's when you grow a plant from seed, and every seedling is genetically distinct from every other seedling and from its parents. Although a fair amount of horticulture does happen in outdoor growing beds and nursery locations, when you go to a greenhouse location like this, you get better control of the growing environment. Things like rain falling down on your plants, or temperature, humidity. You can apply shade if your plants need it. You can also apply artificial light. So this gives you a lot better control of your growing environment. This kind of a structure here is called a polytunnel. This polytunnel is glazed with, well, you guessed it, poly. Another common glazing on greenhouses is glass. There are other ones, but those are the two main ones. This one here, you can divide greenhouse structures into heated and unheated structures. This one has no heat. I don't heat my greenhouse, so this one can sometimes be referred to as a cold frame, which also refers to smaller structures that gardeners use. One way I use to control temperature and humidity in my greenhouse is through ventilation through a roll-up side like this one here. Other ways that growers can control ventilation is either through roof vents or exhaust fans. You may note that underneath my pots of roses I have a black fabric called Groundcloth. That provides a barrier to separate my roses from soil-borne pests and weeds. And of course, another way to keep your plants safe from weeds and other soil-borne pathogens is to grow them on raised benches like these, which are particularly useful in a propagation house. In order to keep track of all the different plants you could possibly grow, it's kind of helpful to break them up into categories, either based on their life cycle or on their growing form. In terms of life cycle, what I mean by that is how long does it take that plant to grow and complete everything it wants to do before it dies. An example of this, the three big categories, there would be annuals, biennials, and perennials. In the annual category, think of something like impatiens that you might go to the garden center early in the year, grab some impatiens, you put them in your yard as a bedding plant, they'll bloom and bloom and bloom, complete all of their flowering in 1 year, and then you are expected more or less to pull them out at the end of the season and put them in the compost pile. They've completed everything from flowering to setting seeds that they would do just in 1 year. The second category are things called biennials, and biennials take 2 years to complete their cycle. Sometimes you'll plant them in the fall and then they'll bloom the next summer, but then that's the end of the story. Things like this might include some things like digitalis or foxglove. The third category are perennials, and perennials is a much larger category than you might think because it includes all of those herbaceous plants that you put in the ground and they might come back for 3 or more years, but it also includes, technically, everything else that lives for a long time in your garden, including all the trees and shrubs. Here are some of my hardy perennials coming back into growth for the season, and hardy is a term that refers to how much winter cold it can accept. So these plants were hardy in my area with some protection. Plants that come back year after year in your landscape are also considered hardy to your area. So it is a relative thing to the place where you live. If you live in a cold winter climate, you obviously will have plants that are less hardy to your area. And if you live in a mild climate, you will have plants that are more plants that are hardy to your area. This brings up an interesting point about the definition of annual and perennial, which is that some plants that are actually perennials in their life cycle in their native place are not perennials where you might live. An example of that might be something like a poinsettia, which grows as a shrub and a perennial shrub in a place like Mexico, outdoors. But if you try to grow it outdoors in my climate, it is definitely an annual. You may find that for all sorts of perennials that are available in garden centers. Things like, say, a viola or a pansy, which may actually be completely perennial in many places, except that what we've done is we've defined them as perennials that are grown as annuals. The same thing may be true for garden mums, which generally will perennialize in many different environments or different climates, but we generally grow them as an annual. Let's talk about the term herbaceous. Herbaceous means something that never grows a woody stem. So something like this Bergenia here, or this Centranthus over here, which dies back fully to the ground in the fall and winter and then resprouts in the spring. That makes it an herbaceous perennial because they have a life cycle longer than a couple of years. If you look up here, you'll see in the background, that's a burning bush. That one is also a perennial, but it's a woody perennial shrub in this case. So what exactly is the difference between a tree and a shrub? They're both woody plants with a long lifespan, and they can be similar in size. This one straight ahead of me is a tree, that's Hovenia dulcis, or raisin tree, and that one you can see has only one single trunk, or that's the way it's forming. If you look over here, that's an elderberry bush. That one is developing multiple stems. That's the difference. There's a lot of crossover here. There are many trees that can be grown in shrub form, and there's many shrubs that can be trained up to tree form. So typically, it's just a detail that we use around the number of stems or trunks coming from the ground. Let's talk now the difference between evergreen and deciduous. This, of course, is an evergreen pine tree. One holds its leaves all the way through the winter. And the one I'm pointing you towards, that's a deciduous tree. That's Acer griseum with beautiful ornamental peeling bark. So deciduous loses its leaves over the winter. You can see down below it, that's boxwood, which holds its leaves over the winter. So that's an evergreen too. Oftentimes, people will use the term evergreen to refer to only things like the pines and conifers, but there are plenty of examples of evergreen shrubs and perennials as well. Getting back to cultivation now, here's a seeding or a plug tray, which you might use for placing your seeds into to germinate them. And germination is when you're trying to get your seeds to sprout. That will happen if you give it the right combination of temperature and moisture for the variety that you're trying to seed. If you're putting it into a tray like this one here, you're doing that for later transplanting, probably into a larger size. If some varieties or some species will want to be direct sown, which means you're either going to put the seed directly into the final planting size container, or you're going to plant the seed directly out into the garden. And again, that's going to depend on variety. In this case, I'm going to use the seeding tray, and here you'll see me poking a little hole in there. That's called dibbling. I do that before I put my seed in so that I can get it down a little bit deeper into the soil. Dibbling is something you can do when you're planting seeds, or you can also dibble a pot before putting a plug into it. So it's any making of a hole to make room for something else. That's, I think, a horticulture specific term. Here I have 3 packages of seeds. The one on the right is Limnanthus douglasii. That is poached eggplant, and it's the same as the wild species. It's unhybridized. The 2 on the left are hybridized. They've been selected for their special qualities from 2 or more parents and maintained as separate populations for seed production. So Indian Prince for that dark orange color, and Soraya just for stronger and better and more uniform flowering. Here's some more seedling terminology. If you're seedlings begin to stretch really hard looking for the light, they get quite thin. That's called etiolation. There's other kinds of stretching that can happen in young seedlings to do with too much heat, too much humidity, too little air movement, but etiolation is the most common. Another bad thing that can happen to your seedlings is if they start to grow up nice and straight, but then you see them thin out at the base of the plant and just drop right over. It's very distinctive. That one is called damping off. Now, once you've gotten through those awkward early stages of seeding, they put out their true leaves, they're starting to grow nice and stout, you'll have to do something called hardening off if you've started them indoors under warmer conditions. You'll want to expose them over the course of a couple of weeks to cooler temperatures, more air movement, more direct sunlight. That's the hardening off process. Now, I've done another video, and I'll include some clips here from it, about what you do after germination when you're growing your seedlings on, or growing on, as you would call it. And that is things like pinching. So as your seedlings start to grow, you may decide to pinch them to encourage more branching in the seedlings. Other things you might do, if you've had multiple seeds in a cell, you might do some thinning to cut off the base of the extras within a cell to just reduce it to a single plant per cell. You will also do things like roguing, where you see ones that aren't right. If you've got a seedling package and some of them just aren't coming up the right way, you can tell it's not the same variety, you'll rogue those ones out. Culling is a similar thing, where you pull out the weaklings or the plants that aren't doing very well. When you're done with all of these steps of dealing with the seedlings and their plug trays, you'll do a transplant on it. No matter if you've started your plants from cuttings or from seed, at some point you'll have to feed them, and that we can break the fertilizer down into two basic categories. There's organic fertilizers and conventional fertilizers. I'm not going to try to tell you which one is better, I'm just going to try to tell you what they are. So on the left here, you'll see an organic fertilizer. By organic, what it means is that it's being judged to come from natural sources, in this case feather meal, and it's going to take some time when you introduce that to your soil for the soil microbes to break it down and make it available to your plants. So that's the process. It actually feeds the soil, or the soil biology, and not the plant directly. And in that case, it takes a little bit longer, and you have to be a little more careful about how you have to apply it. Conventional fertilizers are the chemical fertilizers. In this case, a 20-20-20 on the right here, and that one is a liquid feed fertilizer. It also comes in another form if you look down here. That one is a controlled release or slow release form of fertilizer. Now, whichever way you're trying to provide these, they break them up into the kinds of nutrients that your plants need. Macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients are the ones that your plants need in relatively large amounts. In this case, you're talking about the ones you normally see listed on the fertilizer package, and when you see this 20-20-20 on the side of the red package, that means it's 20N, 20P, 20K. NP and K is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are three of the macronutrients, but not the only macronutrients. There's also calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, which your plant needs in fairly large amounts. Then there's the micronutrients, and that includes all sorts of stuff, things from chlorine and iron and boron and copper and manganese and everything else that your plant may need in very, very small quantities, but nevertheless needs to complete its biological processes. While we're still surveying production methods, let's talk about grafted plants. Here you'll see a grafted rose, and by grafted what I mean is that the rootstock, or the part of the plant that's under the ground of the soil and just poking up above it, belongs to one type of rose, and then they've grafted on the scion or bud stalk of another variety of rose, and that's what you see. The stems growing up are of the scion variety. The reason they do this, and they do it commonly in roses and they also do it in fruit trees, is they're trying to get some of the good qualities of the rootstock to impart to the plant. So in terms of fruit trees, for instance, you may have an apple tree that's grafted onto a dwarf rootstock, meaning that you're going to try to get a smaller tree out of what would otherwise be a too large variety. When it comes to roses, it's kind of the opposite thing. They're trying to impart more vigor and disease resistance from the rootstock to the top stalk, which may be a weaker grower on its own. Just a quick bit on plant parts here, and I won't go too deep into it because most people have an intuitive sense of this. The roots are the parts that anchor the plant into the soil and pull up water and nutrients. The stems are the parts that support further growth above the ground, including leaves and branches and the flowers. And the crown, right in the middle there, is the point where the roots transition to the stem. The crown is a really important part of the plant because if you lose the crown of the plant, it cannot survive. So oftentimes, if you see something like crown rot setting in, that's a pretty serious problem in a plant. The leaves, of course, are where all the photosynthesis happens, and that provides the sugar or energy for the growth in the rest of the plants. There are tissues in the stem that move that sugar downwards and reposition it throughout the body of the plant. Those tissues are called the phloem, and there's other tissues or vascular tissues inside the stem of the plant that move the water and nutrients upwards from the soil, and that's called the xylem. Because of the time of the year, I won't be able to show you any flowers in my greenhouse today, but I want to give you a couple pieces of vocabulary anyway. The first one being dioecious. Now, dioecious means that there's a plant that has a male plant over here with male flowers and a female plant over here with female flowers. So to that degree, you would say that the human race is dioecious, having biological males and biological females. This is not the case for many of the plants in the flowering kingdom. Many of them are monoecious, meaning they bear male and female flowers on the same plant, or sometimes even male and female flowers as the same flower. So for instance, if you look at a rose up close, you will see that it is both perfect and complete. Perfect meaning it has both male and female parts, and complete meaning it also has petals and sepals, all on the same plant. Now, another distinction term I want to give you about flowering is once flowering versus repeat flowering. And this just depends on the variety of the plant. For instance, rhododendrons, if they bloom their heads off early in the year, they're finished though. They're done for the year, and they're not going to bloom again until they set buds in the fall and then bloom the following season. Roses and hydrangeas, modern hybrids of those, plus many annuals and perennials, they're repeat blooming, meaning that if you were to deadhead them after their first set of blooms, they will initiate new flowers so long as the seasonal conditions permit them to do so. And that's something you can manipulate as a horticulture person, is if you're cutting back plants and getting rebloom, you can get another opportunity for sale, or if you have a big crop and you're not sure you can sell it all in one shot, you can stage it as well, cutting back half the crop now and getting bloom early, and then maybe bloom in 3 or 4 weeks from then when you have more time for selling. One of the activities we're doing in our greenhouse today is up potting. So we're taking plants from this 1 gallon size and we're moving them up to a larger 2 gallon size. The reason we're doing that, we're putting it into new fresh potting soil, but we're also trying to stop it from becoming root bound. And root bound is what will happen if your roots grow all the way to the bottom of the pot and then they have no place to go, so they start circling around and becoming congested at the bottom of your plant. That's not a great thing. It's not going to be very successful in the garden over the long term. So that's why we do up potting, and before we move that over from one pot to the other, we'll probably be breaking up the roots on the bottom of there to cure the problem of it being root bound. And while we're talking about repotting, I also wanted to clarify that we're using potting soil and not natural soil from the garden. Eventually, all these plants that I'm growing will thrive in natural garden soil, but for now, because they're young plants, I prefer to grow them in a potting mix, which is less likely to have soil pathogens in it. So in this case, it's a mix of perlite and composted wood parts, but you can also have ones that are made out of cocoa peat or cocoa fiber, ones that are made out of peat moss, ones that are made with perlite or pumice or vermiculite or any other sort of mix of components. So there's a wide range of them out there, and this one here has fertilizer incorporated right in. That's that slow release fertilizer that I showed you earlier. Well, I can't finish this out without talking a little about pests, as unpleasant as the topic is. Pests are any living thing that it damages your crops as you're growing them. So on the insect end, you may have things like aphids and spider mites and thrips as some of the big ones. On the pathogen side, you have things like funguses that attack the foliage or the roots or the crowns of your plants. Weeds, of course, are a pest, but it can even be things like rabbits and deer are pests on your greenhouse or your nursery operation. So in terms of dealing with those things, what we do typically is something called integrated pest management. Integrated pest management means that first you do a lot of scouting and checking and looking for the pests, monitoring them before you take any action. And the actions that you take focus generally on those things that are cultural before moving on to things like pesticides. So cultural controls may include changing the temperature, changing the spacing of your plants, how you water them, doing all of those things before you finally result to something like a pesticide. The final term I'm going to talk about here is grower. A grower is a person who manages all of this, who talks about all of the conditions of the growing environment, talks about the heat, the temperature, the humidity, and everything, monitors for pests, makes crop decisions. That's what a grower does in a horticultural operation. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, drop those below the video.